December 9th, 1940. Sidi Barrani, Egyptian-Libyan border. Major General Richard O'Connor, 51 from County Cork, stood in darkness watching 275 Matilda tanks form assault columns. His hands traced battle maps one final time. Ahead waited 150,000 Italian troops in fortified camps. Behind him, 36,000 Commonwealth soldiers, half the enemy's strength. The numbers made no tactical sense. His staff had questioned the plan for weeks. Attack a force 4 times larger, march 70 miles through desert to strike camps that intelligence confirmed held 6 divisions. The Italian 10th Army under Marshal Graziani controlled 500 miles of Libyan coast. They'd invaded Egypt 3 months earlier, stopped at Sidi Barrani, built massive fortified positions. Every military textbook said defenders with numerical superiority in prepared positions couldn't be dislodged without matching force. What O'Connor's staff didn't know within 62 days, their commander would shatter every assumption about desert warfare. His Western Desert Force represented Britain's only offensive capability in late 1940. London was burning under Luftwaffe raids. The Atlantic convoys bled merchant tonnage daily. Singapore faced Japanese pressure. This thin line of British, Australian, and Indian troops was all that stood between Mussolini's African Empire and the Suez Canal. Lose here, and the Mediterranean became an Axis lake. Win, and Churchill gained his first victory against fascism. But how do 36,000 men defeat 150,000? O'Connor had studied the Italian defensive system for weeks. 9 fortified camps spread across 40 miles, each separated by 15-20-mile gaps. Matilda Camp, Tamar West, Tamar East. Nibeiwa Camp, the southernmost position, held 4,000 troops and 23 M1340 medium tanks. Italian commanders assumed desert terrain between camps made them mutually supporting. They calculated wrong. The general's plan exploited those gaps. His 7th Armored Division would race through open desert, south of Nibeiwa, cutting Italian communications. The 4th Indian Division, supported by 50 Matilda infantry tanks, would assault Nibeiwa directly at dawn. Matildas carried 70 mm frontal armor. Italian 47 mm anti-tank guns couldn't penetrate at standard engagement ranges, but the Matildas were slow, mechanically unreliable, and few in number. Lose them, and the offensive died. The problem: nobody had attempted this before. Nobody knew if 50 tanks could break a fortified camp. Nobody knew if thinly spread forces could maintain momentum across hundreds of miles. 300 miles northwest, at Bardia Fortress, Italian General Annibale Bergonzoli inspected his garrison. Electric Whiskers, troops called him that for his distinctive facial hair, commanded 45,000 men behind 18 miles of anti-tank ditches, concrete bunkers, and wire obstacles. Bardia was Italy's strongest position in North Africa. Engineers had spent months building defenses that German advisors called impregnable. Bergonzoli didn't know the Commonwealth forces moving towards Sidi Barrani. He didn't know his army's communications were about to be severed. Within 3 weeks, he'd be defending Bardia alone, cut off, watching his water supplies dwindle. 2 armies, separated by 150 miles of desert, one prepared for siege warfare, the other preparing to rewrite the tactical manual. Neither understood what the next 62 days would prove. Back at Sidi Barrani, Sergeant Jim Muldoon, 28, from Melbourne, checked his Matilda's fuel gauges. 300 gallons for a machine that consumed fuel like water and sand. His crew had painted invincible on the turret. Optimism or denial, he couldn't decide. Around him, 49 other Matildas rumbled into night positions. The plan called for a 70-mile approach march, silent running, reaching assault positions before dawn. 1 mechanical failure, 1 enemy patrol, and surprise, died. Could 50 tanks really break a fortified camp holding 4,000 defenders? The Matilda the Sioux represented Britain's attempt to create an infantry support tank. Thick armor, 2-pounder gun, maximum speed, 15 monoreferir. Brilliant for breakthrough operations, catastrophic if caught in open ground by faster Italian tanks. Muldoon had trained on Matildas for 6 months. He knew every bolt, every weakness. The Liberty engine overheated in desert conditions. The suspension broke on rocky terrain. The cooling system required constant maintenance, but that 78mm armor, nothing the Italians fielded could touch it at combat ranges. His gunner, Corporal Davies, 24 from Cardiff, loaded practice rounds for the 100th time. 2-pounder shells, high velocity, good penetration, terrible high explosive effect, perfect for killing tanks. Useless against infantry in trenches unless you scored direct hits. Davies had calculated firing solutions until his eyes ached. Italian M1340 tanks had 30mm frontal armor. His 2-pounder would punch through at 1,000 yards, but the M1340s were faster, more maneuverable. In a pursuit, they'd run circles around Matildas. The mathematics of armored warfare reduced to simple equations: armor thickness versus shell penetration, speed versus firepower, numbers versus surprise. O'Connor was gambling that surprise and armor would overcome numbers and speed. What the Commonwealth forces didn't realize, they were about to demonstrate principles that would dominate armored warfare for the next 5 years. Concentration of force against weakness, rapid exploitation through gaps, bypass strong points, destroy logistics. Every major offensive from Kursk to Normandy would echo what happened in the next 62 days. At 0500 hours, Matildas crossed the start line. 70 miles of night march through trackless desert began. Navigators used compass bearings and dead reckoning. No lights, no radio transmissions. Each tank followed the vehicle ahead through darkness absolute. One wrong turn, one broken track, one overheated engine, and the assault schedule collapsed. Lieutenant Colonel John Combe, 42 from Edinburgh, commanded the 11th Hussars Reconnaissance Regiment. His armored cars had been scouting Italian positions for weeks, mapping patrol patterns, identifying weak points. Tonight, his vehicles led the Matilda column through gaps in Italian surveillance. Every mile covered brought them closer to Nibeiwa. Every mile increased the risk of discovery. His driver, Private Thompson, 21 from Yorkshire, steered by moonlight filtered through sand-laden air. The western desert in December was freezing at night, scorching by day. Thompson wore 3 layers under his uniform. His hands were raw from handling frozen metal, but he kept the Morris armored car moving at exactly 12 meters, slow enough for tanks to follow, fast enough to reach positions before dawn. Could they really cover 70 miles undetected? Behind the spearhead, 4,000 soldiers of the 4th Indian Division marched through darkness. Rajputana rifles, Punjabis, Baluchis, regiments with battle honors dating back centuries. They'd trained in mobility warfare for months. Now that training faced reality, cross 70 miles of desert, assault a fortified camp at dawn, then continue advancing against an enemy 4 times your strength. Captain Ravi Singh, 29 from Lahore, led his company of Rajputana rifles. His men carried 60 pounds of equipment, each weapons, ammunition, water, rations for 3 days. They'd march all night, fight all day. How long could men sustain that pace? Singh had studied the Sidi Barrani terrain. Open ground approaching Nibeiwa camp meant no cover. His troops would assault across 800 yards of killing ground while Italian machine guns fired. The Matildas would suppress enemy positions, but tanks couldn't clear trenches. That required infantry moving forward under fire, closing with defenders. His letter home sat in his pack, unfinished. What do you write before an attack that military logic says should fail? Dawn broke at 7:15 hours on December 9th. Matildas reached assault positions 2,000 yards south of Nibeiwa camp, undetected. The 70-mile night march had worked. Italian sentries watched north and east, expecting attacks from Egypt. Nobody watched the southern desert. O'Connor's gamble on surprise had paid off, so far. Nibeiwa camp spread across rocky terrain tents, supply dumps, artillery positions, tank parks. 4,000 Italian troops prepared breakfast. Their 47mm anti-tank guns pointed toward expected threat axes. Their M1340 tanks sat in revetments, crews not yet mounted. The camp commander had reported situation normal at 0700 hours. He had no idea 50 British tanks sat 2,000 yards away, preparing to attack. What happened in the next 4 hours would determine whether O'Connor's offensive died at the first objective or transformed into something unprecedented. The Matilda tank seemed an unlikely instrument for revolutionary warfare. Britain had designed it in 1936 for infantry support, thick armor, slow, speed, heavy enough to crush wire obstacles and cross trenches. Its two-man turret was cramped. Commander and gunner fought for space while performing their tasks. The 2-pounder gun had excellent armor-piercing capability, but terrible high-explosive performance. Yet these limitations became advantages in desert warfare, where armor protection outweighed speed. Could a weapon designed for European trench warfare work in North African desert? Major General Percy Hobart had pioneered mobile warfare concepts in the late 1930s while commanding Britain's experimental tank brigade. His ideas seemed radical: concentrate armor, strike fast, bypass strong points, destroy enemy logistics. The British Army High Command had dismissed his theories as impractical. They'd forced him into early retirement in 1939. Now his protege, O'Connor, was proving those theories in combat. The Matilda's 78mm frontal armor created tactical possibilities other tanks couldn't match. Italian 47mm anti-tank guns needed to fire at point-blank range, under 400 yards to penetrate. That meant Matildas could advance across open ground that would be suicidal for lighter tanks. They could absorb hits that would destroy cruiser tanks or Italian M1340s. This advantage, combined with surprise and concentration, transformed tactical equations. What Italian intelligence didn't know, British tank production had delivered exactly 172 Matilda II by December 1940. O'Connor had received 50 of them, nearly 30% of Britain's entire inventory. London was gambling everything on this offensive. At 0715 hours on December 9th, those 50 Matildas began their assault on Nibeiwa camp. They advanced in line abreast, 2,000 yards across open ground. Italian sentries spotted them at 0720 hours and sounded alarms. Defenders rushed to gun positions, but the camp's anti-tank guns faced north and east. Reorienting them toward attacking tanks required precious minutes. Sergeant Muldoon's Matilda fired its first round at 0723 hours, range 1400 yards. The 2-pounder shell struck an Italian artillery position, destroying a 75mm gun. Around him, 49 other Matildas opened fire. The barrage shredded Italian positions before defenders could respond effectively. Italian 47mm anti-tank guns began firing at 0725 hours. Shells struck Matilda hulls and turrets, creating sparks and impact marks, but rarely penetrating. The British tanks absorbed dozens of hits while advancing. This was the Matilda's purpose: survive defensive fire long enough to reach decisive range. The numbers proved devastating. Italian after-action reports documented 23 direct hits on a single Matilda at ranges exceeding 800 yards. 0 penetrations. The tank continued advancing, destroying gun positions. Italian gunners realized their weapons were useless and began abandoning positions. At 0735 hours, Matildas reached the camp perimeter. Now their weakness showed: the 2-pounder gun couldn't effectively suppress infantry in trenches. High explosive shells had insufficient blast effect. That's when the 4th Indian Division arrived. 4,000 Indian troops assaulted across the same ground Matildas had crossed. Captain Singh's company of Rajputana rifles advanced behind tank cover. Italian machine gun fire intensified. Men fell every few yards, but the Matildas drew most defensive fire. Their armor protected both tanks and following infantry. Singh's men reached Italian trenches at 0750 hours and went into them with bayonets and grenades. Close combat erupted across 40 positions simultaneously. This was infantry work, brutal, personal, requiring courage that no amount of armor could provide. his company lost 17 men in the first 15 minutes, clearing 3 trench lines. But they kept advancing, expanding the breach, allowing follow-on troops to penetrate deeper. The problem O'Connor's staff was watching from headquarters 15 miles away, unable to communicate effectively with forward units. Radio equipment in 1940 was primitive. Tank radios had 3-mile range under ideal conditions. In combat, with interference and terrain, that dropped to less than 1 mile. Commanders had to make decisions based on 30-minute-old information. By 0900 hours, Nibeiwa camp was collapsing. Italian defenders in the southern sector had either surrendered or fled north, but the northern defenses still held 2,000 troops with intact positions. The battle could still reverse if Italian reinforcements arrived from neighboring camps. What O'Connor's intelligence officer didn't know, commanders at Tumor West Camp, 15 miles north, had received reports of fighting but couldn't determine scale or location. Italian communication systems required runners and motorcycle dispatch riders. Information that should take minutes required hours. This communication gap would prove more decisive than armor or tactics. At headquarters, O'Connor made his critical decision: exploit immediately. Don't consolidate. Don't wait for support. Send 7th Armored Division west to cut the coast road. Isolate Italian camps from each other. Turn a tactical success into operational breakthrough. Some staff officers objected. The plan called for methodical reduction of each fortified camp in sequence. Rushing west exposed supply lines. The armored division might outrun its logistics and be stranded without fuel or ammunition. Every principle of cautious warfare argued for consolidation. O'Connor overruled them. Speed was everything. Italian confusion represented an opportunity that wouldn't last. Hesitation would allow them to reorient defenses, rush reinforcements, stabilize the front. The window of exploitation might stay open for hours or close in minutes. He ordered 7th Armored to move immediately. At 0930 hours, 120 British cruiser tanks and armored cars began racing northwest across open desert. Their objective, the coast road near Buk Buk, 50 miles away. Success meant every Italian position east of there would be isolated. Failure meant the armored division would be destroyed piecemeal. While tanks raced west, Nibeiwa camp continued disintegrating. By 10:30 hours, organized resistance had ceased. Commonwealth forces counted 4,000 Italian prisoners. The camp had fallen in 3 hours, but casualties told different stories. British tank losses: 0 tanks destroyed, 7 damaged by mechanical failure. Indian infantry losses: 56 killed, 234 wounded. The Matildas had absorbed punishment that would have destroyed lighter forces. The tactical lesson was clear: properly armored tanks, properly employed, could break prepared defenses at acceptable cost. But the operational question remained unanswered. Could momentum be sustained across hundreds of miles? Could logistics support rapid exploitation? Could morale survive when every calculation suggested defeat should follow initial success? By noon on December 9th, reconnaissance units reported chaos in Italian command structures. Radio intercepts indicated confused messages between camps. Some units were requesting orders. Others reported Commonwealth tanks behind their positions, which was impossible according to Italian battle maps. The information gap was widening into panic. What happened next transformed tactical success into operational crisis. For Italy, O'Connor's forces had broken through at one point. Now they would demonstrate what breakthrough meant: not just penetrating enemy lines, but exploiting penetration faster than defenders could react. Every hour that Italian commanders debated response, Commonwealth forces advanced deeper. Every delay in counterattack widened the penetration, and Italian command structures, built for deliberate positional warfare, couldn't process battlefield changes fast enough. This was the revolution, not better weapons or brave soldiers. Both sides had those, but better tempo. The side that could observe, decide, and act faster would collapse the side that needed more time for those cycles. O'Connor's troops were rewriting operational art, while Italian commanders were still trying to understand tactical reports from Nibeiwa. Could one breakthrough at one camp really unravel an entire defensive system? While Nibeiwa camp smoldered, Commonwealth forces were already moving against the next objective. Tamar West Camp, 15 miles north, held 2,500 Italian troops from the Catanzaro Division. They'd heard distant gunfire since 0730 hours, but received no clear orders. Their commander, watching the southern horizon for approaching dust clouds, faced an impossible decision: stay in fortified positions or withdraw to avoid encirclement. He chose to stay. That decision doomed his garrison. At 1300 hours, the same Matildas that had assaulted Nibeiwa approached Tamar West. But now Italian defenders understood what they faced. Anti-tank guns opened fire at maximum range. Artillery batteries concentrated on approach routes. The welcome was violent and prepared. The battle's dynamics had shifted. Surprise was gone. Italian gunners had learned that 47 mm shells couldn't penetrate Matilda frontal armor at normal ranges, so they adjusted tactics aimed for tracks, immobilized tanks, then engaged with artillery at close range. The first Matilda took track damage at 1320 hours from concentrated fire. The crew evacuated safely, but the disabled tank marked a new phase. Sergeant Muldoon's Matilda absorbed 14 hits during the approach. His driver reported engine temperature climbing to dangerous levels. The afternoon desert heat, combined with combat conditions, was pushing machinery to limits. But they continued advancing, firing, suppressing gun positions yard by yard. The assault succeeded by 1530 hours, but the pattern was clear: each subsequent camp would be harder, slower, costlier. Italian defenders were adapting. They might lack communication between camps, but individual commanders were learning from observed combat. If this trend continued, the offensive would grind to halt through attrition. 300 miles northwest, at Tobruk Fortress, Italian intelligence officers tried assembling coherent reports. They'd received fragments heavy fighting at Sidi Barrani, camps overrun, Commonwealth tanks moving west, radio traffic indicating confusion, but nobody could provide clear enemy strength estimates or operational intent. Were the British conducting limited raids or full offensive? The intelligence gap worked both ways. O'Connor didn't know Italian force disposition beyond the immediate battle area. He didn't know if strategic reserves existed. He didn't know if German reinforcements might arrive. He was operating with partial information, making decisions that committed his entire force based on assumptions about enemy weakness. That afternoon, the 7th Armored Division reached positions west of Buk-Buk. They'd covered 50 miles in 6 hours across open desert, an operational maneuver that shouldn't have been possible with 1940 logistics. But Lieutenant Colonel John Combs' supply columns had followed immediately behind combat elements, carrying fuel and ammunition forward. Combs' improvised logistics system violated every established doctrine. Normal procedure called for establishing supply depots, then conducting operations within that depot's radius. Combs was doing the opposite, advancing first, bringing supplies forward to wherever combat elements stopped. The risks were enormous. One ambushed supply column would strand the entire armored division without fuel, but the payoff was operational tempo that Italian commanders couldn't match. How long could they sustain this pace before exhaustion or mechanical breakdown stopped them? By December 10th, Commonwealth forces controlled 60 miles of Libyan coast. Behind them lay 6 destroyed Italian camps and 20,000 prisoners. Ahead lay Bardia Fortress with its 45,000 defenders and elaborate fortifications. The strategic situation had transformed in 36 hours. But transformation came at cost. Tank mechanics reported 40% of cruiser tanks needed major repairs. Matilda crews reported mechanical issues affecting half their vehicles. Infantry battalions showed fatigue levels that normally required days of rest. Supply trucks had traveled over 300 miles across desert without maintenance. The entire force was operating beyond sustainable limits. O'Connor faced decision pause to consolidate, repair, and resupply, or maintain pressure despite exhaustion. His staff recommended consolidation. Every military manual suggested it, but O'Connor saw Italian disarray, and knew that hesitation would allow them to recover. He ordered continued advance. At Bardia, General Bergonzoli watched Commonwealth forces approach. His fortress sat on coastal escarpment with 18 miles of anti-tank ditches, concrete bunkers, and wire obstacles. The perimeter included 400 pillboxes, 120 artillery pieces, and elaborate communications trenches. German military advisors had declared it impregnable. Bergonzoli had 45,000 troops, adequate supplies, and strong morale. Let the British come. What Bergonzoli didn't calculate, his water system relied on wells outside the fortress. Commonwealth artillery could target those wells, turning Bardia's strength, large garrison, into weakness. More troops meant faster water consumption. Siege warfare was about logistics, not courage. By December 15th, reconnaissance patrols confirmed Italian forces had withdrawn from all positions between Sidi Barrani and Bardia. The coastal road was open. O'Connor's forces controlled 100 miles of territory they'd captured in 6 days, but his entire offensive now faced a fortified position that couldn't be bypassed. Bardia controlled the only usable port for 200 miles. Taking it required set-piece assault against prepared defenses. The operational pause lasted 2 weeks, while Australian 6th Division moved forward to replace exhausted Indian troops. During that period, Commonwealth engineers repaired tanks, rebuilt supply lines, and accumulated ammunition for the Bardia assault. Italian defenders used the same time to strengthen fortifications and prepare for siege. Military historians would later debate whether O'Connor should have attacked immediately or accepted the operational pause. Immediate assault might have caught Bardia before defenses fully manned, but his forces were genuinely exhausted. Continuing without rest risked collapse. The pause allowed recovery, but gave Italy time to reinforce. No perfect solution existed. At Australian 6th Division headquarters, Lieutenant General Thomas Blamey studied aerial reconnaissance photos of Bardia. His Australians had arrived in Egypt 6 months earlier, trained but untested in combat. Now they would conduct their first major assault against fortress defenses that looked formidable on every photograph. His planners identified the weakest sector, a 2-mile front on the western perimeter where the anti-tank ditch was narrowest and pillbox spacing widest. They'd concentrate the remaining Matildas there. 23 tanks still operational after repairs. The Australians would follow tanks through the breach, expanding penetration before Italian reserves could counterattack. Could 16,000 Australians break a fortress holding 45,000 defenders? The question wasn't rhetorical. Bardia's fall or survival would determine whether O'Connor's offensive continued or ended. Success meant advance to Tobruk and beyond. Failure meant retreat to Egypt and strategic stalemate. Everything depended on whether lessons learned at Nibeiwa could scale to fortress warfare. On January 3, 1941, the Bardia assault began. Lieutenant Jack Campbell, 26 from Sydney, crouched in darkness 400 yards from Bardia's perimeter. Around him, 100 men of the Australian 16th Brigade waited for dawn. They'd marched 5 miles through freezing desert to reach assault positions undetected. Now, at 0530 hours, they watched Matilda's move forward toward the anti-tank ditch. His hands shook, not from fear but from cold. December nights in the western desert dropped below freezing. His troops wore summer uniforms because winter kit hadn't arrived from Australia. They'd fought cold all night and would fight heat once sun rose. But first they'd fight Italians. The tactical plan seemed straightforward. Matildas would suppress pillboxes, while engineers filled anti-tank ditches with fascines, bundles of logs that created vehicle crossings. Australian infantry would follow tanks through gaps, assault trenches beyond, and establish a bridgehead for exploitation. Simple on paper. Complex when 400 Italian machine guns opened fire simultaneously. At 0540 hours, 13 Matildas began advancing. Within minutes, the distinctive sound of 47mm anti-tank guns echoed across the perimeter. Italian defenders had learned to aim for tank tracks, the only vulnerable point. The first Matilda shed its track at 05:45 hours and stopped, immobile but still fighting from fixed position. Campbell's company started forward at 600 hours. 800 yards of open ground separated them from the anti-tank ditch. Italian artillery, pre-registered on likely approach routes, began firing. The first shells landed short. Adjustments came quickly. Within 2 minutes, shells were impacting among advancing troops. Men fell. Others closed ranks and continued forward. This was the reality of assault warfare. Advance despite casualties. Maintain momentum despite losses. Close with defenders who had every advantage of prepared positions and interlocking fire. Stopping meant death. Advancing meant casualties. But advancing gave chance of success. His platoon reached the ditch at 06:15 hours. It was 15 feet wide, 12 feet deep, with scarped sides. Engineers were already working, dropping fascines, creating crossings under machine gun fire. Campbell watched 3 engineers fall in rapid succession. Others took their places, working with desperate speed. The fascines settled. Matildas crossed. Infantry followed. The problem crossing the ditch concentrated troops in kill zones that Italian gunners had prepared for months. Campbell's company lost 23 men crossing 50 yards, but they reached the far side, got into Italian trenches, began clearing positions. Close combat allowed Australian aggression to offset Italian numerical superiority. What Campbell didn't know, while his brigade assaulted the western perimeter, 2 other brigades were attacking northern and southern sectors. O'Connor had learned from Nibeiwa, don't attack at one point, attack simultaneously at multiple points. Force defenders to divide reserves. Create multiple crises they can't address simultaneously. By 0800 hours, Australian troops had penetrated 800 yards beyond the perimeter at 3 locations. Italian communications had broken down under the multi-axis assault. Bergonzoli's headquarters received contradictory reports: southern sector breached, western sector holding, northern sector status unknown. Without clear information, he couldn't commit reserves effectively. 200 miles east, at O'Connor's advanced headquarters near Sollum, staff officers tracked battle reports. Radio messages arrived, fragmented and delayed. But the pattern was clear: Australian assaults were succeeding. The Bardia perimeter was cracking at multiple points. Major Robert Laycock, 34, from London, commanded the headquarters security detail. His job was boring: guard senior officers while real soldiers fought. But that morning, he was watching history. O'Connor was orchestrating a battle across 18 miles of front using radio communications that frequently failed and maps that showed incomplete terrain. The general was making decisions with partial information, committing reserves before confirming initial reports. This was command at operational level, deciding with uncertainty, accepting risk, maintaining momentum despite incomplete knowledge. At 0930 hours, O'Connor ordered commitment of reserve armor. The 7th Armored's remaining tanks would exploit through the western breach, turn north inside the perimeter, and attack Italian positions from the rear. It was a calculated gamble. If the Australian penetration was narrower than reported, tanks would be committed to a killing ground. If wider, they'd collapse the entire defensive system. The reserve tanks began moving at 1,000 hours. 43 cruiser tanks, mechanically questionable after 300 miles of operations, advanced through gaps Australian infantry had torn in Italian defenses. Once inside the perimeter, they turned north and began a mounted charge along the rear of defensive positions. Italian troops in fortified positions, facing outward, suddenly found British tanks attacking from behind. Pillboxes designed to be impregnable from the front were vulnerable from rear. Communications trenches became death traps as tanks fired down their lengths. The defensive system, so strong when facing outward, collapsed when attacked from multiple directions simultaneously. Could 43 tanks really break 18 miles of fortifications from inside? The answer came by noon. Italian units began surrendering in company and battalion strength. Bergonzoli's command structure disintegrated as officers lost contact with their troops. Radio messages became increasingly desperate. Under attack from all directions. Request instructions. Casualties heavy. Need immediate support. But there was no support. Italian strategic reserves didn't exist. Everything available was already committed to Bardia's defense. The fortress was isolated, besieged, now collapsing from internal breakthrough. Bergonzoli faced the same choice commanders had faced throughout history: fight to annihilation or surrender while troops survived. 15 miles offshore, HMS Terror, a monitor carrying two 15-inch guns, fired her 20th salvo of the day. Commander James Somerville, 42, from Devon, watched shells impact near Italian coastal batteries. His mission was simple: suppress Italian artillery that could hit Australian troops. But nothing about naval gunfire support was simple. The problem: hitting targets ashore required precise coordinates, current weather data, and real-time observation of fall of shot. Terror's fire control systems were designed for naval engagements, not land bombardment. Somerville was improvising, adjusting based on radio reports from shore that took 15 minutes to arrive and were often unclear. His ship had been bombarding since 100 hours. Crew fatigue was showing. Gun crews had fired 140 rounds of 15-inch ammunition. Each shell weighed 920 pounds and required 6 men to load. The rate of fire had dropped from 2 rounds per minute to 1 round every 90 seconds. Physical exhaustion was degrading performance, but the effect ashore was cumulative. Italian coastal batteries had fallen silent by 1100 hours. Some were destroyed, others were abandoned by crews who couldn't withstand the heavy shells. Somerville's bombardment hadn't won the battle, but it had eliminated Italian artillery that could have massacred Australian troops during their assault. This was combined: arms warfare tanks, infantry, artillery, and naval gunfire, operating as integrated system. None alone could win. Together they created effects that overwhelmed Italian capacity to respond. The coordination wasn't perfect. Communications failed frequently. Attacks weren't precisely synchronized. Friendly fire incidents occurred. But the overall effect was operational success despite tactical imperfections. At 1400 hours, Somerville received orders to cease fire. Australian forces had penetrated so deeply that continuing bombardment risked hitting Commonwealth troops. He secured the guns and watched smoke rise from Bardia. His crew had fired 187 rounds in 8 hours. They'd contributed to victory they would never fully see from 15 miles offshore. Inside Bardia town, Captain Giorgio Mancinelli, 31, from Rome, commanded the last organized Italian resistance. His company of black-shirt militia held government buildings near the harbor. Around him, the fortress was collapsing, but his 120 men had ammunition, water, and orders to hold. At 1600 hours, Australian troops began clearing the town building by building. This was combat at its most personal, room-to-room fighting, where courage mattered more than numbers. Mancinelli's troops had advantage of prepared positions. Australians had advantage of momentum and aggression. The fighting lasted 4 hours. His company inflicted 34 casualties before being overwhelmed. Mancinelli survived and entered captivity. Understanding something fundamental: individual courage couldn't offset operational collapse. His men had fought well, but they'd fought as isolated unit in a battle already lost. Bravery without operational context was just sacrifice. By 2,000 hours on January 4th, Bardia had fallen. Commonwealth forces counted 40,000 Italian prisoners, 400 artillery pieces captured, 130 tanks taken intact. Bergonzoli had escaped with small staff group before the final collapse. His fortress, declared impregnable, had fallen in 36 hours. O'Connor didn't pause. On January 6th, he ordered advance to Tobruk, 70 miles west. The pattern was established: attack before defenders recovered, exploit confusion, maintain tempo. But his forces were critically depleted. Tank strength had fallen to 82 operational vehicles from 275 at campaign start. Infantry battalions reported 30–40% casualties. Logistics was barely functional. Staff officers calculated they needed 2 weeks to rebuild combat power. O'Connor gave them 48 hours. Speed trumped preparation. Italian command structures were disintegrating. That window wouldn't stay open. On January 21st, Australian and British forces assaulted Tobruk using identical tactics, multiple simultaneous penetrations, armor exploitation from inside the perimeter, naval gunfire support. The fortress fell in 24 hours. Another 25,000 prisoners, another 200 artillery pieces, another collapsed defensive position. The operational pattern was complete. O'Connor had demonstrated that properly conducted mobile warfare could defeat numerically superior forces in prepared positions. The keys were concentrate armor at decisive points, maintain operational tempo, exploit success immediately, accept risk, and operate beyond comfortable logistics ranges. Could this pace continue all the way to Tripoli? The statistics from Operation Compass redefined what seemed militarily possible. Between December 9th, 1940, and February 7th, 1941, 62 days. O'Connor's Western Desert Force advanced 500 miles, destroyed 10 Italian divisions, captured 130,000 prisoners, seized 845 artillery pieces, and captured 380 tanks. Commonwealth casualties, 1,900 killed and wounded. The force ratio that began at 14 disadvantage had reversed into a 170 victory ratio. These weren't propaganda numbers. Italian military archives confirmed them. British after-action reports documented them. The mathematics of the campaign seemed impossible, but were verified by multiple independent sources. How did 36,000 men defeat 150,000? The answer lay not in individual battles, but in operational tempo. Commonwealth forces completed decision cycles. Observe, orient, decide, act. Faster than Italian commanders could respond. By the time Italian headquarters issued orders, the battlefield situation had changed. Their commands addressed problems that no longer existed or created responses to threats that had already moved. What the campaign proved modern warfare was about speed of decision-making as much as firepower. The side that could process battlefield information faster gained decisive advantage. O'Connor's forces weren't better equipped than Italian armies. They weren't vastly more numerous. They were faster in thought, communication, and action. That speed differential compounded over 62 days into operational collapse. The strategic impact cascaded through multiple theaters. Mussolini's African Empire lost credibility. Hitler was forced to commit German forces to North Africa. The Afrika Korps under Rommel arrived in February 1941. Those forces were diverted from Operation Barbarossa planning, reducing German strength available for invading Soviet Union. British morale, battered by defeats in Europe, surged. Churchill gained his first major victory against Axis powers. Mediterranean strategy shifted from defensive to offensive, but the operational impact proved more significant than strategic. Military planners worldwide studied Operation Compass. The campaign demonstrated principles that would dominate warfare for decades: concentration of armor, combined arms coordination, exploitation through gaps rather than frontal assault, maintaining tempo despite logistics challenges, and accepting tactical risk for operational gain. Soviet planners studying the campaign noted O'Connor's emphasis on speed and developed it into deep operations doctrine. American officers preparing for North African landings studied the logistics improvisation. German planners recognized that their own blitzkrieg concepts had been validated by an opponent. The campaign became case study in military academies from Moscow to West Point. Yet it raised troubling questions. Could Britain sustain this pace? O'Connor's forces were exhausted, equipment depleted, logistics stretched beyond doctrine. The advance stopped at El Agheila in February 1941, not because Italian resistance stiffened, but because Commonwealth forces physically couldn't continue. Tanks were broken, troops were exhausted. Supply lines, stretched 500 miles across desert, couldn't support further operations. What would happen when German forces arrived with better equipment and commanders, trained in mobile warfare? The answer came quickly. Rommel's Africa Corps counterattacked in March 1941. O'Connor was captured during reconnaissance. His successor commanders lacked his operational genius. The Western Desert Force, which had seemed invincible in January, was pushed back to Egypt by May. The same operational principles O'Connor had demonstrated were now used against Commonwealth forces by an enemy who understood them better. The human cost extended beyond casualty statistics. Lieutenant Campbell survived Bardia, but was killed at Tobruk. Sergeant Muldoon's Matilda broke down permanently after 600 miles of operations. He transferred to cruiser tanks and died at Beta Fam. Captain Singh received the Military Cross for his actions at Nibeiwa and Bardia, continued fighting until 1945, survived the war, and returned to newly independent India. Commander Somerville's HMS Terror was sunk by German aircraft in February 1941. He survived and commanded escort carriers in the Atlantic. These individual stories represented thousands of similar fates. The campaign that seemed so decisive in February 1941 became first phase of a 3-year struggle across North Africa. Victory at El Alamein in 1942 and final Axis surrender in Tunisia in 1943 were distant futures when O'Connor's troops captured Tobruk. But Operation Compass retained significance beyond its immediate military impact. It proved that properly led, properly equipped forces could defeat larger armies through superior operational art. It validated mobile warfare concepts that would shape the next 50 years of military doctrine. It demonstrated that courage, when combined with intelligent planning and aggressive execution, could overcome numerical disadvantage. The 62-day miracle left another legacy it established: Australian, Indian, and British Commonwealth forces as capable of world-class military performance. These weren't American troops, or Soviet masses, or German professionals. They were citizen soldiers from democracies, led by competent but not brilliant commanders, equipped with adequate but not superior weapons. And they'd achieved one of the most lopsided victories in military history. O'Connor later wrote, "We demonstrated that war is decided by thinking, not counting. The enemy counted soldiers and tanks. We counted time and opportunities. They focused on positions we might attack. We focused on positions they couldn't defend. Victory came from understanding that faster decisions, consistently applied, compound into operational dominance. That principle resonates today. Modern militaries study Operation Compass for its lessons on decision cycle speed, combined arms integration, logistics improvisation, and aggressive exploitation. The campaign's tactical details are obsolete. Nobody fights with Matilda tanks or 47mm anti-tank guns, but its operational concepts remain relevant. Speed still defeats strength. Initiative still trumps position. Tempo still compounds into victory. The last Commonwealth veteran of Operation Compass died in 2018 at age 102. He'd fought at Sidi Barrani, Bardia, and Tobruk. In final interviews, he recalled not the battles, but the exhaustion. "We didn't know we were making history," he said. "We knew we were tired, hungry, scared, but we kept moving forward because stopping seemed more dangerous than continuing. That's all warfare really is, continuing when stopping seems smarter." 62 days, 36,000 men, 130,000 prisoners, 500 miles of territory, numbers that still seem impossible 85 years later, but archives confirm them. Veterans witnessed them. History records them. Operation Compass remains proof that in warfare, as in life, the impossible is just the difficult done right.